Imagine this. The year is 1918. The First World War has just torn the planet apart, leaving millions dead and entire nations scarred. People think the worst is finally behind them. But they are wrong, because just as the cannons fall silent, a new enemy rises, one that cannot be seen, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot be stopped by any army. An enemy so ruthless it would kill more people than the war itself. This was no invasion of soldiers. It was an invasion of disease. This is the story of the Spanish flu, the deadliest pandemic in human history. The United States in 1918 was buzzing with change. Cities were crowded with workers and immigrants. Troops were moving in and out of military camps as they prepared for the last push in Europe. Doctors were still learning about germs, but antibiotics didn't exist. Vaccines were limited, and most households didn't even have indoor plumbing. In short, medicine was not ready for what was about to happen. The first whispers of trouble came not from Europe or Asia, but from deep in America's heartland. In March 1918 at Camp Funston in Kansas, a soldier named Albert Gitchell reported sick with a sore throat and fever. Within hours, dozens more followed. Within days, hundreds. What looked like a seasonal flu was spreading like wildfire. This first wave of illness swept through military camps and cities across the US. But strangely, it didn't seem catastrophic, at least not yet. The symptoms were severe, but most people survived. The newspapers barely covered it, and the government downplayed it, not wanting to distract from the war effort. But the virus was learning, mutating, waiting. By the summer of 1918, American soldiers carried the sickness across the Atlantic to Europe. In the filthy trenches of France, where men lived in mud, rats, and misery, the flu found the perfect breeding ground. Soldiers coughed in cramped dugouts, shared contaminated food, and marched in endless streams from one town to the next. Each step they took spread the invisible enemy further. What made this flu different was who it attacked. Unlike normal influenza, which usually kills the very young and the very old, this virus had a cruel twist. It struck hardest at the healthiest, young adults in their 20s and 30s, people in the prime of life. Their strong immune systems overreacted, filling their lungs with fluid. Many drowned in their own bodies within days. Doctors were baffled. They had no cure, no treatment, no explanation. One doctor in Boston wrote, "The faces of the sick are a peculiar mahogany color. They suffocate as if strangled, their bodies turn blue, and they die in hours." Still, the world barely noticed. The war dominated the headlines. Government censored bad news, afraid it would weaken morale. Spain, a neutral country, had no censorship. So their newspapers reported honestly about the epidemic. The result? Everyone assumed the plague had begun there, and so it earned a name that would stick forever, the Spanish flu. But the real storm was still to come. The first wave had been only a warning. By the autumn of 1918, the virus returned, more deadly than ever. This time it would kill with terrifying speed, and no city would be safe. In the next chapter, we'll step inside the streets of America as panic takes hold. From Philadelphia's doomed parade to San Francisco's masked rebels, the Spanish flu would soon transform daily life into a nightmare. This was not just a flu. This was war by another name. The year was 1918, and America was about to learn that its greatest enemy wasn't tea across the ocean in Europe. It was waiting right outside their doors. What began in quiet army camps was now sweeping into America's biggest cities, and within weeks, the United States was under siege by a killer no bullet could stop. Philadelphia, September 28, 1918. The city planned a massive Liberty Loan Parade to raise money for the war. Despite warnings from doctors about the mysterious new flu, officials pressed forward. After all, the war needed funds, and the public needed morale. More than 200,000 people crowded shoulder to shoulder as marching bands played and soldiers paraded down Broad Street. Flags waved, children cheered, and few noticed the coughing in the crowd. Within 72 hours, hospitals were overflowing. Within a week, thousands were sick. Within a month, 11,000 Philadelphians were dead. Coffins piled up in the streets. Families were forced to stack bodies in their homes, waiting for gravediggers who could no longer keep pace. The city had turned into a morgue. Philadelphia was only the beginning. Boston, New York, Chicago, all were hit like dominoes. Schools shut down, theaters closed, church services were banned. Cities went eerily silent except for the constant sound of ambulance bells. Doctors worked until they collapsed. Nurses begged for help. In some places, streetcars ran empty because drivers were too sick to work. Mail delivery slowed to a crawl. It wasn't just the flu killing people. It was the collapse of everyday life. On the other side of the country, San Francisco took a different approach. The city passed a law requiring every citizen to wear a mask in public. Newspapers proudly called it a patriotic duty. Red Cross volunteers stitched gauze masks by the thousands, handing them out to anyone caught without one. At first, compliance was high, but as weeks dragged on, frustration grew. Some refused to wear them, calling it an invasion of personal freedom. Soon, an unlikely group emerged, the Anti-Mask League of San Francisco. They held rallies, protested fines, and demanded the mask order be repealed. Sound familiar? History, it seemed, had a way of repeating itself. The flu was merciless. Families vanished overnight. Young parents died, leaving orphans to fend for themselves. Priests gave last rites in alleys and doorways. In some towns, wagons rolled down the streets with drivers shouting, "Bring out your dead!" And yet, despite the horror, the government urged calm. Officials told people to wash their hands, avoid crowds, and hope for the best. But how do you avoid a killer that strikes in a handshake, a breath, or a single cough? As the death toll climbed, the Spanish flu leapt across oceans, striking Europe, Asia, and Africa. Soldiers who had survived bullets and bombs were now dying by the thousands in hospital tents. This was no longer just an American nightmare. It was a global catastrophe. And the world was about to discover that the second wave would be the deadliest of all. The Spanish flu did not respect borders. It did not need passports, ships, or diplomacy. Wherever human beings traveled, the flu followed. By late 1918, the sickness that had started in small army camps in Kansas had grown into a global firestorm, burning its way across continents. No nation was spared. Europe, already broken by 4 years of war, became the flu's next great battlefield. Soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder in trench lines became perfect victims. Men who had survived machine guns and poison gas collapsed in their bunks, suffocating within hours. Entire regiments were crippled. One British commander wrote, "The flu is achieving what the German army could not." In France, hospitals overflowed, and towns that had barely survived the war now faced funerals every day. Civilians were so weak from hunger and shortages that the flu cut through them like wildfire. The virus then leapt eastward. In India, it struck with unimaginable ferocity. Famine and poverty left millions vulnerable. By the time it was over, an estimated 12 to 17 million Indians were dead, one of the worst single disasters in the nation's history. Funeral pyres burned day and night. In Japan, trains carried the flu from city to city. In China, it spread along trade routes and ports, devastating rural villages that had no doctors or medicine. In Africa, colonial troops carried it home from the front lines, igniting outbreaks that wiped out entire communities. There was no escape. The Spanish flu was everywhere. Perhaps the most shocking element of this plague was who it killed. Unlike most diseases, which claim the weak and the old, the Spanish flu showed no mercy to the healthiest. Young adults in their 20s and 30s, the very generation fighting in the war, were its prime victims. Strong immune systems went into overdrive, creating a deadly cytokine storm that drowned victims in their own fluids. One nurse described watching young men turn blue within hours, their faces darkening as they struggled for air. Some died in less than a day. Imagine entire families struck down at once. Parents, children, grandparents, all gone in the span of a week. In cities from Paris to Bombay, carts filled with corpses rolled down the streets. There weren't enough coffins, not enough priests, not enough graveyards. With no space for the dead, mass graves became the grim solution. In places like South Africa and Spain, bodies were buried in trenches, stacked one upon another, sometimes without names. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed cultures and communities. Fear spread faster than the flu itself. Schools shut their doors, shops closed, and public gatherings disappeared. Entire towns were abandoned as survivors fled into the countryside, praying that isolation might save them. By the winter of 1918, the Spanish flu had reached nearly every corner of the globe. Soldiers, families, and leaders alike were powerless. Science was failing, Medicine was failing, and with every passing day, hope seemed to fade. But humanity refused to give up. Doctors, nurses, and ordinary citizens began fighting back, searching for answers in the face of the invisible killer. The next chapter will reveal how science, courage, and desperation collided in the battle to stop the deadliest pandemic in history. By late 1918, the Spanish flu had circled the globe, killing with a speed and ferocity the world had never seen. Entire nations were paralyzed. Cities stood silent. Families were torn apart overnight. But amid the fear and despair, humanity began to fight back, not with weapons of war, but with science, medicine, and sheer determination. The tragedy of 1918 was that medicine was simply not ready. The flu virus itself was invisible to doctors. Viruses were too small to be seen under the microscopes of the time. Nobody knew what caused the illness. Some blamed dust, some blamed bad air, and others thought it was spread by bacteria. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no antivirals. Doctors could do little more than offer bed rest, fluids, and prayers. And yet, they tried. Hospitals overflowed, forcing staff to turn schools, churches, and even private homes into makeshift wards. The true heroes of the pandemic were not generals or politicians. They were the nurses, volunteers, and ordinary citizens who risked their lives to care for the sick. Many nurses worked until they themselves collapsed, often dying of the same illness they tried to treat. In Philadelphia, the Red Cross issued desperate pleas for help. Nurses are needed. Nurses are dying. We must have more. In rural towns, neighbors nursed one another, bringing food to doorsteps and caring for orphaned children. The flu revealed both the cruelty of fate and the courage of compassion. With science powerless, people turned to folk remedies and superstition. Newspapers advised gargling with salt water, wearing garlic necklaces, or chewing raw onions. Some claimed whiskey could cure the flu, while others swore by tobacco smoke. In truth, none of it worked. Masks became the most common defense. Gauze masks, often little more than cloth strips, were handed out by the thousands. They offered some protection, but not enough to stop the spread. Still, they symbolized hope, the idea that people could at least try to shield themselves from the invisible killer. Scientists worked feverishly to solve the mystery. Many believed a bacterium called Haemophilus influenzae was the culprit. Under the microscopes of the day, it was the best guess they had. Only decades later would researchers realize the truth. The Spanish flu was caused by a virus, something no one in 1918 could even see. This blind battle against the unseen enemy explains why the death toll was so devastating. Humanity was fighting in the dark, and yet, even in the darkest moments, glimmers of hope appeared. Communities came together, caring for orphans, feeding the hungry, and comforting the dying. Nurses, often women barely out of training, became soldiers in their own war. One Red Cross nurse later recalled, "I lost track of the number of patients I held as they took their last breath, but I also remember the joy of those who lived." Every survivor was a victory. By 1920, the Spanish flu began to fade, almost as suddenly as it had arrived. But it left behind a world forever changed. 50 to 100 million people were gone, nations scarred, families shattered. In the final chapter, we'll explore the legacy of the pandemic, how it reshaped medicine, changed society, and left lessons that echo all the way to the present day. The Spanish flu was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point for humanity. By the spring of 1920, the Spanish flu that had terrorized the world for nearly 2 years began to vanish. There was no miracle cure, no vaccine, no great medical discovery that ended it. The virus simply mutated into a weaker form, as influenza often does, and the deadliest pandemic in human history slipped quietly into the past. But the scars it left behind would never fade. In the end, the numbers were staggering. Between 50 and 100 million lives lost. Nearly 1 in 3 people on Earth infected. In the United States alone, 675,000 deaths, more than all the American soldiers killed in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Entire families were erased from the record books. Children grew up without parents. Communities shrank overnight. There was hardly a household untouched by grief. The Spanish flu left behind more than graves, it reshaped society. In its aftermath, governments began to invest in public health systems. New organizations were born to study disease and prevent future outbreaks. Hospitals expanded and medical training accelerated. The idea of quarantine, mask mandates, and social distancing became ingrained in public health policy. Though primitive by today's standards, they laid the foundation for modern disease control. The pandemic also changed culture in subtle ways. Art, literature, and even music reflected a world haunted by death and fragility. It was no coincidence that the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, exploded with energy, freedom, and decadence. After years of war and disease, people wanted to live, to dance, to forget. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of the Spanish flu is how quickly it was forgotten. Overshadowed by the Great War, its memory faded from textbooks and public conversation. For years, the Spanish flu was just a shadow in history, until COVID-19 revived its memory. Masks, lockdowns, fear, protests, even mistrust of science. The world realized history does not stay buried. It repeats. Yet the Spanish flu is remembered not only for its tragedy, but for humanity's resilience. We endured the deadliest pandemic in history and survived. Science advanced, societies adapted. Courage and compassion carried us through. One survivor would later reflect. We did not know if tomorrow would come, but when it did, we chose to live. The Spanish flu of 1918 was more than a health crisis. It was a turning point, a reminder of both our fragility and our strength. And as new threats emerge, one haunting question remains: what will the next pandemic teach us? Like, share, and subscribe for more echoes of the past, where history's lessons live on.